Thank you so much, Deborah-ji, for this invitation, and to everyone at Martin Chautari for organizing this event, and to all of you for joining today. Actually, many years ago, at the very beginning of my fieldwork, I attended a talk here on mental health beyond facilities. That talk proved to be extremely generative for my research, and the connections I made with the speakers that day actually ultimately led to a co-authored publication with Dr. Navaraj Upadhyay on building Nepal's mental health system in times of emergency that was published in a special series on Nepal earthquakes in the Journal of Cultural Anthropology. So in many ways, that article was the seed for what has now become a book project. And which is to say, I think the work that Martin Chautari does to foster intellectual exchange in and on Nepal is vital, and it's such an honor to be here today and to share my research with all of you. So, kind of full circle. Okay. So, between 2012 and can everyone hear me? It's okay? Okay. Between 2012 and 2016, I conducted 30 months of multi-sited ethnographic research on mental health governance in Nepal, where in the decades following the influx of Bhutanese refugees and the end of the People's War, there's been a proliferation of donor-funded NGOs for mental health and psychosocial counseling. The growth of psychiatry and counseling is transforming Nepal's therapeutic landscape, which, as we know, is a region with a rich tradition of Ayurvedic and Tibetan medicine, as well as ritual and shamanic healing modalities for the treatment of psychic and spiritual affliction. On April 25th, 2015, halfway through my fieldwork, Nepal was struck by a 7.8 magnitude earthquake, followed by a 7.3 magnitude aftershock. 9,000 people died, and 500,000 were left homeless. The disaster radically reconfigured the therapeutic landscape and my understanding of the field. So, faced with the challenge of making anthropology immediately useful, I conducted collaborative ethnographic research alongside a leading Nepali NGO for mental health and counseling, who provided humanitarian psychosocial interventions in earthquake-affected districts. My book project is an ethnography of a mental health crisis in post-disaster Nepal. In this work, I bring disaster studies into conversation with medical and psychological anthropology, the anthropology of ethics and morality, and critical phenomenology. The central focus of this project is what I call the psychic life of disaster. This encompasses the biopolitics of mental health in times of crisis, the existential and affective dimensions of disaster, and the forms of care that follow in disaster's wake. My talk today is based on a chapter from this book project. This is a work in progress, so I'm really looking forward to thinking with all of you about this material and the arguments that I'm developing. The talk is titled Psychic Intervention, the Crisis of Mental Health in Times of Disaster. And I have to admit that the title might be slightly misleading, as my focus today is not the existential experience of disaster, but the public declaration of a mental health crisis and its rippling after effects. Instead of taking the crisis of mental health as an unquestioned point of departure, I follow the ways claims of crisis have been used to justify the expansion of new forms of mental health governance. To approach crisis in this way is not to deny the lived reality of post-earthquake suffering, but to explore how suffering comes to be objectified as something requiring certain techniques of intervention. In May 2015, the international news media began reporting on Nepal's mental health crisis. According to these articles, the impact of the disaster would cause widespread trauma with increased risks of PTSD and depression. It was assumed that long-term mental suffering could be prevented only through immediate psychosocial intervention. The sense that mental health was now in crisis was palpable in Kathmandu, where an unprecedented amount of activity and attention was gathering around this new matter of concern, enabling the crisis of mental health to emerge as a matter of fact. Prior to the earthquake, I had been spending time within different Nepali NGOs for mental health and psychosocial counseling in Kathmandu, as well as shadowing Nepali psychiatrists in a Kathmandu hospital outpatient psychiatric clinic. Now many of these experts have been swept up into the humanitarian response. In the aftermath of the earthquakes, the once quiet mental health NGO offices were now frenetic with activity as project managers from donor organizations arrived in jeeps to negotiate contracts. In Nepal, although a mental health policy had been drafted and endorsed by the government in 1997, it had never been fully implemented. 2 decades later, mental health had not yet been incorporated into the public health care system. Psychiatric services remained concentrated in the capital of Kathmandu and in select district hospitals, and mental health system development had been largely dependent on the work of individual champions. Outside of these institutional resources, for the past decade, temporally finite donor-funded community mental health programs provided uneven access to care in a handful of working districts. From this perspective, mental health, or at least access to psychiatric and counseling services, had been in crisis for a long time, but had not been critiqued as such in public discourse. What is a crisis and how can we approach it anthropologically? Crisis is a surprising concept. As Reinhard Koselleck has shown in his conceptual history, in classical Greece, the word crisis referred to a moment requiring critical deliberation between right and wrong, good and bad, life and death. In Greek, the root of the word crisis is krino, which means to separate, to choose, to judge, to decide. Crisis had juridical, medical, and theological meanings. In each sphere, crisis was a critical condition calling for an act of judgment to set things right again. In this sense, crisis implied the work of critique. However, today, we no longer recognize crisis as a time of careful deliberation. As the political theorist Wendy Brown has argued, there's frequently a sense that critique is an unnecessary luxury in dark times, that disaster is not the time for theorizing. As a result, crisis has become a blind spot. As anthropologist Janet Reitman puts it, that is, crisis claims are made, but we rarely examine how such claims are determined. As a news headline in Wired magazine read, "Let's stop Nepal's mental health crisis before it happens." To stare into the blind spot requires examining a priori claims and narratives of crisis and the actions they made possible. While many organizations focused on providing short-term mental health and psychosocial support, some humanitarians, inspired by the World Health Organization's Building Back Better framework, used the declaration of crisis as an opportunity to expand mental health services in Nepal. Humanitarians are aware that crisis can be harnessed to generate care, at least momentarily. In 2013, the WHO published a report titled Building Back Better, Sustainable Mental Health Care After Emergencies. In this report, the authors argue that because international aid flows during times of crisis, a situation of disaster or emergency should be seen as a quote, important opportunity for mental health reform and development, end quote. The report is accompanied by a series of exemplary case studies of countries, including Iraq, Sri Lanka, and Indonesia, where mental health systems were constructed in times of emergency. Following the Building Back Better report, humanitarian organizations like International Medical Corps, funded largely by public donations on Facebook, turned to the task of building Nepal's mental health system, blurring the boundaries between development and humanitarianism. In Nepal, there have been multiple effects of crisis claims. Primary among them has been the self-justification of intervention into the psychic lives of the population. This form of governance has proliferated around the world over the past 30 years, during which time the mental health of populations has become a global concern. Today, psychic life has become the new terrain of biopolitics, that distinct form of power bent on making live, that first emerged in 18th century Europe alongside fields of demography and social hygiene that made population thinking possible. In the case of Nepal, the biopolitics of mental health has been led largely by foreign development experts and sometimes anthropologists who, since the 1980s, have drawn on various rationales and forms of scientific knowledge to manage the problem of mental health in a country with many shamans but comparatively few psychiatrists. Drawing on a combination of ethnographic and archival research, in what follows, I read post-disaster claims of crisis through the lens of a longer history of mental health governance in Nepal. This story begins in the archives of a community mental health project in the 1980s, travels through the rise and fall of psychosocial interventions for trauma and PTSD in the mid-2000s, and ends tentatively with the emergence of the global mental health movement. Although each era is connected to the local specificity of Nepal's conflicts, catastrophes, and political transformations, the Panchayat era, the Maoist insurgency, the influx of Bhutanese refugees, the 2015 earthquakes. The problematization of mental health in Nepal has always closely mirrored broader trends in the field of global health. I will then turn with fresh eyes to the UN cluster meetings, where a heterogeneous group of experts gathered in the aftermath of the earthquakes to seize the opportunity of disaster to build back better, and to imagine what the future of Nepal's mental health system might become. By placing the post-disaster mental health crisis in historical context, we can begin to understand how and why specific visions of mental health development were prioritized in the aftermath of the 2015 earthquakes, while others were not. Large-scale interventions into the psychic life of populations are not a new phenomenon. As Eric Lindstrom's historical work on psychology in the British Empire illuminates, early colonial interventions involved social scientists, including anthropologists, who were interested in the possibility of subverting anti-colonial uprising and aiding colonial rule by studying the inner lives and dreams of colonial subjects. A half-century later, the World Federation for Mental Health, WFMH, was founded in London with the explicit goal of promoting modernization in the post-colonies by identifying its local psychological impediments. As Lindstrom points out, a manual prepared by famed anthropologist Margaret Mead for the WFMH titled Cultural Patterns and Technical Change, quote, recommended easing the frustrations of rapid change by turning to group therapy, encouraging the subjects of development to share their difficulties with each other. By the early 1950s, the management of psychic life had been transformed from a problem for colonial rule to the key to successful post-colonial development. While Nepal was never colonized, the logics and rationale of its early mental health development programs were influenced by this Anglophone lineage. When the primary healthcare movement took hold in the field of international health during the late 1970s, mental health was seen as a field ripe for development. In 1975, the World Health Organization's Expert Committee on Mental Health published a galvanizing report on the organization of mental health services in developing countries. The meeting was held in Geneva in October of 1974, where Nigerian psychiatrist and then Deputy Director General of the WHO, Dr. T.A. Lambo, opened the event. Dr. Lambo emphasized that new advancements in psychopharmacology had created previously unimaginable possibilities for mental health treatment in developing countries. The urgent need to develop mental health services was justified with the shock-inducing statistics, which declared that, quote, in developing countries, over 40 million men, women, and children are suffering from serious untreated mental disorders. Threats to citizens' well-being included rapid population growth, crisis in food production, internal migration, and accelerated social change. Echoing the ideas of the WFMH, the report argued that development itself produces problems of adjustment and adaptation that should be of general social concern, as well as having important implications for mental health. The experts conjured disturbing visions of the extent of the crisis when they wrote of the, quote, rural masses and the urban concentrations of deviants who were unable to manage their mental afflictions because of lack of access to proper mental health services, i.e. psychiatry and not traditional healers. Inspired by the WHO's report, in 1984, a Christian missionary organization called United Mission to Nepal, UMN, launched the first mental health development program in the country. The UMN's mental health project ran for 14 years and focused on drug abuse, community mental health, training health workers, counseling expats, providing services in the Dulikhel jail where the homeless mentally ill were incarcerated, and contributing to the development of the curriculum at the Department of Psychiatry in the Institute of Medicine. And this is a UMN training card for health workers that I found in the archives when I was doing some archival research, and I'd be happy to talk more about their position towards indigenous healing in the Q&A or any other questions you might have. According to official reports held in the archives of United Mission to Nepal, the community mental health program was well received during its inaugural years, so in 1985-86. In the first annual report, Dr. Christine Wright, one of the UMN psychiatrists running the program, wrote, "Has been steady and encouraging in most areas of the work, and I am often aware of the rightness of the timing for our project here in Nepal. There are many openings, and I feel a great role at present for us in stimulating the development of services and interest in alternative models of care. I am grateful to God for his guidance in so many new situations." Like the humanitarians that would arrive following the 2015 earthquakes, Dr. Wright emphasized that the timing was right to expand psychiatric services in Nepal. While the need for mental health services was not framed in the language of crisis, it had been justified by a study undertaken in 1983, which claimed that over 10% of people in a village south of Kathmandu were suffering from mental illness. Dr. Wright saw her community mental health work in Nepal as a project guided by God. In 1996, UMN helped to draft the first Nepal mental health policy, calling for the creation of a mental health department within the Ministry of Health. Yet, although they laid the foundation, Dr. Wright's sense of timing was not quite right. UMN was ultimately not able to accomplish the full incorporation of mental health services at the primary healthcare level, or the creation of a mental health department in the Ministry of Health. While a description of the program was included in the World Mental Health Casebook as an exemplary case study, the Mental Health Project officially ended in 2003. However, this did not mark the end of mental health development programs in Nepal, only their transformation. In their analysis of the history of the concept of trauma, Didier Fasson and Richard Rechtman have argued that as psychic wounding in the aftermath of violent events has gained acceptance in the field of humanitarian psychiatry, trauma has inaugurated a powerful new condition of victimhood. Today, those suffering from the trauma of war, violence, and disaster garner sympathy and gain access to compensation on the basis of their victim status, mediated by a vast network of international mental health and psychosocial support professionals who document their stories in detailed case write-ups. Fasson and Rechtman have called this phenomenon the empire of trauma to describe how the language of trauma and PTSD has become the dominant prerequisite for care, compassion, and even citizenship in the 21st century. And I'd be happy to talk more about this later if you have questions. When I first traveled to Nepal as a graduate student in the summer of 2012, the therapeutic landscape I encountered had been profoundly shaped by the Maoist insurgency and the trauma-focused projects and programs it had attracted. I spent my days in an NGO that specialized in mental health services for victims of torture. Inside the converted bungalow, the office walls were decorated with paintings, cartoons, and photographs of torture scenes, alongside decorative sketches of the faces of indigenous Nepal. Occurring simultaneously with the People's War was the influx of 100,000 ethnically Nepali Bhutanese refugees who were resettled in the eastern district of Japa by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. The relocation of Bhutanese refugees and the violence of the People's War drew a new breed of international experts to Nepal. Peace and conflict programs funded by development and UN agencies proliferated. In the area of mental health, there was a new focus on psychosocial interventions in conflict-affected communities, with an emphasis on healing trauma among specific victim groups, such as ex-child soldiers. The psychosocial approach understood individual psychological distress as embedded in social relations. By the late 2000s, psychosocial interventions had become a dominant component of international development projects around the world, which operated under the assumption that healing the trauma of individual citizens would help repair the nation in the aftermath of war and conflict. Following the Dwanda, interventions into the psychic life of the population were framed as a way to heal not only personal distress, but also social and political division. My first summer in Nepal, I traveled to the district of Dang to accompany Kathmandu NGO staff on a training workshop. Dang had been an important site for psychosocial interventions, as it was a destination for internally displaced people during and after the People's War. As part of their work in the region, the NGO focused not only on psychosocial counseling for PTSD among victims of torture, but also on basic psychiatric diagnostic training for health post workers. In the airless hotel training hall of a small town, the health workers assembled under whirring fans, sipping hot tea to cut iron with iron in the heavy monsoon heat of the Terai summer. Although my Nepali was not yet strong, I was able to understand that the health workers were being taught how to identify and pharmaceutically treat depression, anxiety, PTSD, and conversion disorder among their clients. And so here we see how the Dwanda also served to propagate the expansion of psychiatry in certain parts of the country. In 2014, I traveled to Dang once again. During my stay with a local psychosocial counselor, I joined her on an external evaluation of a psychosocial project that was finally concluding. In many ways, it was a typical project evaluation focused on collecting success stories from patients and health workers who had benefited from participation in the program. We traveled by jeep from village to village, visiting ex-clients in their homes and asking them if and how they had benefited from counseling and medication. The evaluators were surprised to learn that the leading cause of mental distress in Dang was not the Dwanda, but love tragedy and migration. Yet neither love nor migration fit into the victim-based model of the post-conflict psychosocial program. The disconnect between the imagined subject in need of intervention and the reality on the ground highlights the limitations of psychosocial programs that focus narrowly on victims of war and trauma. And this also brings to mind a really interesting article by Medeiros, Shrestha, Gaide, and Orr that was published in 2020 on well-being among former child soldiers in Nepal. And the authors argue that while psychosocial interventions framed former child soldiers as passive victims in need of psychosocial treatment, for many of the people who they interviewed who looked back on their experience, they found that their participation in the armed insurgency was an expression of political solidarity and a source of community and well-being. But that kind of framework wouldn't fit into the psychosocial model. Back in Kathmandu, the NGO office was increasingly quiet. PTSD projects were phasing out, and victims of conflict were receding into the background. The empire of trauma was waning, and the NGO staff began brainstorming new project proposal ideas to circulate to their donors. Meanwhile, a powerful new turn in the world of mental health governance was quickly taking root in another NGO across town. And so now I'm going to talk about the emergence of global mental health, which is really the period that I think we're in currently. In 1993, the World Bank published the agenda-setting World Development Report, Investing in Health. This report introduced the concept of disability-adjusted life years, DALYs, that is, the number of years lost to disability caused by illness, as a way to measure the global burden of disease. 2 years later, a team of prominent American medical anthropologists and psychiatrists published the highly influential World Mental Health Report, the, quote, first systematic attempt to survey the burden of suffering related to mental, social, and behavioral problems at a global scale. In the report, mental well-being was framed both as a universal human right and as an economic concern, for, according to this logic, by reducing the burden of disease caused by mental illness, it would become possible to increase economic productivity. The neoliberal economic framing of the cost of mental illness galvanized donor support and transformed mental health into an economic problem worthy of investment. A decade later, The Lancet commissioned the first global mental health series. The first article in the series began with the rallying cry, "No health without mental health," and signaled a return to the goal of supporting the development of the primary healthcare system, with the inclusion of mental health. However, instead of emphasizing deculturation and social change as a risk to mental health, as they did in the earlier period, the new argument for mental health development was couched in the economic language of burden. In the WHO's 2005 report, 14% of the global burden of disease was attributed to neuropsychiatric disorders, with the majority due to the, quote, chronically disabling nature of depression and alcohol use. Here, mental illness was identified as a major constraint to achieving the Millennium Development Goals. In 2016, the World Bank, in partnership with the World Health Organization, held a high-profile event titled Out of the Shadows, Making Mental Health a Global Development Priority. Citing figures showing mental illness to be the leading cause of years lived with disability, it was announced that $1 trillion is lost every year due to lost productivity in the workplace due to depression and anxiety, while every dollar invested in the treatment of depression and anxiety yields a $4 return in better health and the ability to work. And this is an image from that campaign. The role of the World Bank in this new global crisis will be to provide funding and technical support for the development of mental health systems in the global south in order to decrease the prevalence of mental illness in resource-poor countries with the ultimate goal of increasing economic productivity. As the management of mental illness in populations is justified in economic terms, the old link between biopolitics, capital, and the economization of life becomes clear. Since the birth of the movement, Nepal has figured prominently in global mental health research, generating case studies, data, and serving as a key node in multi-country projects. Where are the Nepali psychiatrists, or other healers for that matter, in this story of mental health governance? This is a good question. Not only because Nepali psychiatrists established the field of psychiatry in Nepal in the 1960s, but also because by 2014, in the psychiatric OPD of at least one of Kathmandu's public hospitals, there was a constant flow of patients seeking psychiatric treatment. In the popular hospital where I shadowed psychiatrists prior to the earthquakes, at least 50 patients lined the benches outside the consultation rooms each day, anxiously awaiting their turn for a brief 10 to 15 minute consultation with a psychiatrist. Many patients were residents of Kathmandu, while others came from distant villages by bus, at considerable personal expense. Here in the psychiatric OPD, given the desire for services, the separation between Nepali psychiatry and the world of donor-funded mental health NGOs was puzzling, and this is something I'd be interested in talking about as well in the Q&A. Now that we have a sense of the history of mental health governance in Nepal, let's return to the time of the earthquakes, when an historically unprecedented level of international concern for the mental health of earthquake victims galvanized humanitarian support and suddenly placed mental health at the center of public discourse. On May 29, 2015, the UN Mental Health Subcluster was formed and held its first coordination meeting in a small tent outside the Ministry of Health and Population after the National Health Cluster meeting had adjourned. At the National Health Cluster meeting, the presence of many international humanitarian organizations was highly visible. Everywhere people wore vests emblazoned with logos and acronyms: UN, WHO, UNICEF, MSF, IOM, MDM, which served both as a marker of their expert status and potent symbol of the proximity to money and power. The mental health subcluster was relatively small, an apt reflection of its minor status vis-a-vis physical health in the cluster system hierarchy. Yet it was precisely through such official spaces of gathering that the crisis of mental health began to emerge as fact. In the first meeting, the country directors of IsraAid, International Organization of Migration, Médicos del Mundo, Médecins Sans Frontières, and Handicap International were there, alongside representatives from Nepali mental health NGOs. After the meeting, I spoke with a humanitarian who mentioned it was her first time in Nepal. Like many others, her organization was planning a rapid 6-month intervention with the possibility of extension. The UN cluster system is a bureaucratic mechanism organized by the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs in order to manage the coordination of activities across organizations, collect data on activities implemented, and avoid duplication of services. Such coordination turned out to be a difficult task. 2 parallel groups concerned with mental health were created. The Mental Health Subcluster, part of the Health Cluster, held in the Ministry of Health and Population Office, and the Psychosocial Working Group, part of the Protection Cluster, held across town in the Ministry of Women and Children. I attended both groups, as did many others. Activities were reported weekly to each group separately, documenting the who, what, when, and where of the humanitarian activities. This information was gathered for the purpose of tracking and preventing duplication and was shared in regular email minutes. Meetings proceeded by going around the table, each representative sharing the number of beneficiaries reached and describing the activities done by their organization. I attended these groups from their formation in May 2015 to their dissolution in November 2015, when the blockade at the Indian border made petrol so scarce the members could no longer justify the cost of black market fuel needed to attend the meetings. Over this 7-month period, I watched as many new faces came and went. In addition to INGOs and multilateral organizations were representatives from at least 4 Nepali mental health NGOs who had been subcontracted by international organizations and UN groups to hire and train psychosocial counselors and do the work of mental health and psychosocial support on the ground in the earthquake-affected districts. The cluster meetings were thus split between the Nepali NGO staff on the one hand and the expat humanitarians and development workers on the other. In order to facilitate the work of the newly arrived humanitarians, meetings were held almost entirely in English. In the months following the earthquakes, people began to talk about building back better and what it could mean for the future of Nepal's mental health system. In the context of the humanitarian mental health response, there was much discussion of this in the weekly mental health subcluster meetings. As the group began to form over the following months, it became a place where Nepali and expat mental health specialists, psychiatrists, NGO staff, development workers, humanitarians, activists, and even anthropologists would not only report their activities, but could also talk about the future of Nepal's mental health system. The existence of such meetings had never before happened during the years I had spent in Nepal. So much money was flowing into post-disaster mental health and psychosocial support programs for earthquake victims that it seemed almost anything was possible. I too felt infected by a kind of contagious hope and the feeling that sudden change was imminent. As one Nepali psychiatrist exclaimed to me in the mental health subcluster meeting, the earthquake has been a boon for mental health in Nepal. While many organizations focused on providing short-term mental health and psychosocial support, some humanitarians, inspired by the World Health Organization's Building Back Better framework, used the disaster as an opportunity to build Nepal's mental health system. Aligning themselves with the priorities of the global mental health movement, humanitarian visions of the better focused on increasing access to psychopharmaceutical drugs and training prescribers. At one of the meetings, the expat project manager from an American humanitarian organization rose to share her thoughts. She spoke in a voice full of frustration, complaining about the general lack of coordination and unwillingness of groups to work together. She concluded by saying emphatically, "We must avoid colonial dependencies and try to create sustainable infrastructures for mental health." The American humanitarians' opposition of colonial dependencies with the foreign-led creation of sustainable infrastructures suggested an anxiety, at least at some level, of the closeness of the two endeavors. Colonialism on the one hand, and humanitarianism on the other. The historical lineage from colonial medicine to contemporary forms of humanitarianism is one that has been well documented by both historians and anthropologists. For her, building back better then was one way of avoiding colonial dependencies and addressing the uncertain ethics of providing a population with brief access to care and psychopharmaceuticals in regions where normally such resources were not widely available. Soon a troubling issue began to surface in the cluster meetings: the problem of the abandoned mentally ill. In Nepal, the abandoned mentally ill were at that time unable to receive medical services without a guardian willing to take responsibility for them, a prerequisite for hospital care. The only existing help for this group of people was a Nepali NGO run by a man I will refer to by the pseudonym Vivekji, who brought the issue to the table. Vivekji is a mental health activist in Nepal, and I saw him regularly at both the mental health subcluster and the psychosocial working group, where he would continually bring up the problem of the homeless mentally ill in the groups. Everyone enthusiastically agreed it was a problem, but what could be done? In a mental health subcluster meeting, one of the humanitarians working with IMC mentioned that there might be the possibility of securing money to work on the issue. The group unanimously decided to form a working group to tackle the subject, and I too offered to help in drafting any reports and documents they might need. A palpable sense of excitement took hold. "You must strike while the iron is hot," said a Nepali woman in attendance. The facilitator of the group also approved of the idea, and it seemed that maybe the right people with enough power could also be brought into the conversation. But in the end, the representative of the humanitarian donor organization announced that funding could only be allocated for earthquake-related mental health issues. Even after this failure, Vivekji continued to advocate and ask difficult questions. What will happen to the abandoned children with mental disabilities? What will happen to the abandoned adults with severe mental illness? He asked the room full of humanitarians. He was met with silence. There were no answers, no programs, no planned interventions. The facilitator of the meeting looked at him solemnly and said, "We don't have the capacity." While the disaster presented the opportunity to build back better, ultimately the better was defined by foreign humanitarian and development organizations, not local activists. The seismic event set the work of disaster into motion. Its designation as a crisis worthy of care inspired people to donate money from all over the world. Humanitarians streamed into Nepal in order to stop Nepal's mental health crisis before it happens. Short-term psychosocial interventions were funded to heal trauma among earthquake victims with counseling and psychotropic drugs. And humanitarian agencies like IMC used the sudden increase in national and international attention and resources to fast-track prior development priorities. And humanitarian agencies like IMC used the sudden increase in national and international attention and resources to fast-track prior development goals of expanding Nepal's mental health system. The WHO prepared the Building Back Better policy so that when a situation of crisis is designated as such, previously determined development priorities can be pushed through. The crisis is anticipated as an opening, a possibility to advance specific visions of mental health care that have already been determined in advance. In this way, the earthquake was a boon for mental health governance in Nepal. Many aspects of the mental health system have been developed because of this policy. As Liana Chase has pointed out, additional psychotropic drugs have been added to the free drug list, and the government has created a budget for decentralized mental health care for the first time. Yet it is also important to point out the limitations of having a predetermined understanding of the better. Over the past 40 years in Nepal, the expansion of mental health governance has been justified in relation to a series of imagined figures, the rural masses and the urban deviants, the traumatized child soldier, and the refugee, the earthquake victim. Following broader trends in international health, interventions into the psychic lives of the population have been framed as a way to ease the distress of social change, to heal the nation after war and create new responsible citizens, and to increase economic productivity. The use of crisis narratives to expand access to psychiatric treatment in the aftermath of the earthquakes is only the most recent iteration of a broader story of donor-driven technical intervention that has taken the psychic life of Nepali people as its object of transformation. Looking back across this history of development, one wonders what other visions of care might be possible beyond donor-driven imaginaries of expanded access to pharmaceuticals and increased economic productivity. Yet the moment of crisis was not the time to ask difficult questions. As the NGO offices busied themselves with the project of training community mental health workers, a fleet of newly minted psychosocial counselors prepared to enter the disaster zone, tasked with the responsibility of healing the heart-minds of those who had lost everything. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Erin.